Good morning, everyone. Today our first speaker is Sam Baron from the Dianoia Institute, the SEU medal. And Sam will talk about dialethism and the A-theory fund.
Great. Thank you, Vincent and Baptiste, for organising. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to make a preliminary case for what I'm going to call a dialethic account of passage. I'm going to start just by telling you what that means, briefly, and then I'm going to soften you up for this not being the craziest thing to do by looking at someone who tried this already. So Grandjean tries to give a dialectic account of passage in a bunch of places, so I'll talk a bit about that. And then I'm going to say a little bit about why I don't think his account is fully satisfactory, not in ways that are a problem for him, but ways that are sort of a problem for people who like passage. I'm going to shift a little bit and look at a particular kind of explanatory project that Brad Scow develops in a paper where he tries to explain why time passes, and I'm going to sort of build something that's dialethic that does a lot of what his view does. So the sort of claim here is that I can build something that's at least as good as what Scow has. If you hate what Scow has, then, well, you're probably going to hate this too. But given that there's something to this, I think there's something to this dialectic picture as well. And I'll give you a bit of a comparison and maybe even suggest that the dialectic one is better than the one that Scow has. Okay, so some preliminaries. Dialethism. This is the view, very roughly, that there are some true contradictions. So P and not P is sometimes true for some P. View has been defended by a bunch of people. Graham Priest has sort of, I think, done the most to make philosophers take the view quite seriously. But there are, of course, lots of dialectics kicking around these days. Okay, then we've got the A theory, and this is just the view that the passage of time is a real mind-independent phenomenon. I'll be saying a little bit more about what I take to be the passage of time later on, and I know that there's lots of different versions of the A theory floating around, so you can take what I say as sort of stipulative in this direction. And passage dialethism is just smashing these two things together. So the passage of time is a real mind-independent phenomenon that is also inconsistent. All right, why would you believe such a view? Here's a very direct argument. First premise, the passage of time is inconsistent. We heard about McTaggart's paradox yesterday. I mean, there are lots of people who don't think the paradox has been solved, but it really does demonstrate the inconsistency inside the center of the A theory. Now, what the study of dialethism teaches us is that when you encounter a contradiction, you don't have to take that as a reductio. You can just bite down on the contradiction and accept that some things are real and inconsistent. And so it really depends on what the evidence in favor of the thing that might be inconsistent turns out to be. And if the evidence is sufficiently good, well, then maybe you can just believe that this thing is real and inconsistent. So the first premise, McTaggart's paradox. Second premise, time really passes. Get there however you want. I take it that the strongest argument is some kind of argument from experience. That's one that seems to be at least discussed the most. But whatever gets you to the A theory, whatever evidence you take, plug it in. And then you just get out the end that some kind of passage dialethism is true. I call this the direct argument. I don't think it's going to convince anyone. I think B theorists and A theorists are just going to split right down the middle on the premises. The B theorists probably going to accept 1 and just deny 2. The A theorist is probably going to accept 2 and just deny 1. And I'm not going to really get any traction. I actually think there's something to this argument. I think that it's not super straightforward to defend these kinds of A-theoretic and B-theoretic pictures. So I think maybe there is a way to dialethism through this direct argument, but I recognize that it's not going to be very convincing for lots of people. So here's a different argument. And this argument draws more on the sort of way that people defend dialethism more generally. The way that they defend dialethism is usually via some inference to the best explanation. So for instance, Priest will look at the liar paradox and say the best explanation of what's going on with the liar paradox is that the liar sentence, is both true and false. And so we should believe that there are some dialethia. He also argues that the best explanation of certain accounts of being requires some kind of dialethism as well. And so you see this sort of pattern of argument, this abductive argument. So we can run a kind of argument like that. Time really passes. Well, that's something that the A theorist is going to accept. The best explanation of this, in some sense of explanation and some sense of best, appeals to dialethism. So the passage of time is both real and inconsistent. This has potential to get traction on an A theorist. I think a B theorist is just going to still reject that first premise, but I think it's going to be a little bit harder for an A theorist to wriggle free, so maybe an A theorist is going to have some reason to accept the view that I put forward. All right, here's the core premise of that argument. The best explanation of passage appeals to dialethism. I can't quite show that. What I can show is that it's at least as good as one prominent account of why time passes for a particular explanatory target. As I said, this kind of scale view. I think that's still significant. Shows that the view is at least as serious as that scale picture, depending on how serious you should think that picture is. All right, what I'm going to do first is have a look at someone who's defended that core premise before. So Priest does give you an account of dialectic passage, and he thinks that it's the best explanation of passage. He argues for this in a bunch of places. So he's got 2 independent papers on it, but then in both versions of In Contradiction, both editions, it's in there and gets developed twice over. So he spent a lot of time thinking about this. As far as I can tell, everyone else just sort of ignored that account of passage. So it's kind of interesting to take a look at it anyway. What I'm going to argue is that he doesn't secure a certain kind of passage. I think he does get you a kind of passage of a particular type that's actually quite popular at the moment. So that's kind of interesting. But it doesn't get you a kind of passage that involves a moving present. So this is sort of my first attempt to sort of sharpen up this notion of a passage in terms of the idea that there is an objective present and it moves. And I don't think he gets you that. And so some people in this literature, like Lisa Leininger, they talk about anemic passage and robust passage. These terms themselves are almost as bad as the A theory and the B theory. They seem to mean pretty much whatever you want to whoever you want. I don't want to use those terms, but it's something like that distinction that's here, right? There's some meaty notion of passage and some not so meaty notion, and the Priest picture gets you the not so meaty notion, but that's good enough for lots of people, so you might be happy with that. All right, it is not straightforward, so I'll do my best to get you through the detail here. I'm gonna largely keep this at an impressionistic level rather than digging into the details of the paraconsistent logic that he's using here. So the basic idea rests on this notion called the spread hypothesis. And here's the idea. He thinks a physical magnitude cannot be localized to its value at an instant of time, but only to those values it has at a small neighborhood of that time. So you want to say that an object is at a position in space at a time. And he thinks you can't say that. The best you can say is that the object is at a position in some neighborhood of time because there's this kind of indeterminacy about where things are that's like really deep and real. He doesn't defend this. He takes it from Hegel, he claims. Whether it's in Hegel, I'll leave to Christoph to work out. But he thinks that once you sharpen this up and work it through, it does give you passage. And I think he's right. It gives you something. So here's the idea. Let Q be a quantity, just like the location of a body that can take any value in a set of values, like a set of real numbers, doesn't really matter. Let Q be a function of time, and let Qx be the predicate. Q has the value x, and then he defines this thing called a state. And all this just says is that something has at a time, it has certain values and it doesn't have other values. That's all it really says. But of course, this thing, given the spread hypothesis, is not exactly the thing that you can say, because this is pinning a value to a time. So he's going to do something with this that gets you into interesting territory. So take an interval around a time, and then he defines this thing called a state description. So the state description is the union of these states specified at each time in an interval. And then he sharpens up the spread hypothesis like this. So he says for any time, there's an interval around that time such that for every time in that interval, this entire set of states applies at every time in that interval. Right? So this is trying to get at the idea that you can't localize to a time, but just in the neighborhood. All right, and that's it. That's the machinery that gets you the dialectic picture of passage. And you can see this by just considering what happens when the state description is, when the function is constant, when it doesn't change, versus when it does change. So when it doesn't change, when the function v is a constant, the state description is consistent. So you can think of this as just an object sitting at a place, not going anywhere for the entire interval. And then you look at the states in the sense defined here, and the state's just saying, it's here, it's here, it's here, it's not anywhere else, it's not anywhere else, it's not anywhere else. It's just telling you the same information over and over again. Once you put that all together into the state description, it just gives you back that same piece of consistent information. It's here, it's nowhere else. That's if it's constant. If it's not constant, if the thing is changing, if it's moving, so if we let those numbers there just be different positions in space, well then that state description suddenly starts to say things like it's here at this time and it's not there and it's not there, and it's here at this time, it's not there, it's not there. And once you put all that together, it turns out to be inconsistent. You can just sort of see the inconsistency on its face right here. It's saying it's at 0, it's at 1, it's at 2. It's also not at 0, not at 1, not at 2. It's got all that information, but the state description just combines all of that information. When you combine all that information, it's inconsistent. And that's it for state descriptions. So here's what he gets. He gets this sort of inconsistent state description. That's the main piece of technology in his account. And then he says this. Notice that the state description is inconsistent just if that function is not constant. So if something is changing its position, then the state description is inconsistent, and it's consistent if the thing's not changing. So he just links those two things together and he says, look, change is just a matter of having an inconsistent state description. And again, he puts this on Hegel. He says, oh, this is the Hegel view. Maybe it is. And then he says, we're going to extend this to time itself. So you just take that physical quantity that's in that function, you let it to be time, you let the function map times back to themselves, and what you discover is that the state description delivers this information about what time it is in an interval, and that information is never consistent. And because the identity function over times is nowhere constant, every time is identical to itself, it's not identical to other times. Once you put it all into the state description, you get this inconsistent characterization of time itself. And you can sort of think of this predicate here now as asking the question, what time is it? And because you can't pin that down to a particular time, you can only say what time it is in an interval, and something is all of the times in that interval and none of the times in that interval, you get this inconsistent information coming out. And so if change is just to be an inconsistent state description, well, it turns out that time is changing. And that's what he thinks is passage. He says, I've got a quote here, he says, given the above application of the spread principle, the state of Q at any time is inconsistent. Since the identity function is nowhere constant, this, according to the Hegelian account of change, is exactly what it is to be in a state of change. Thus, the reality of the flux of time does not have to be denied. Neither does it have to be accommodated by the postulation of hypertimes. Right? We didn't do anything with the second temporal dimension there. We just got change just from the inconsistent state description and the use of this function that maps times back into themselves. Okay, but is that right? I think, as I said, it's right for a certain notion of passage, but not right, maybe for other notions of passage. So one way to bring this out is to think of these state descriptions and ask the question, do all of these state descriptions exist together? So think about each time and the interval around each time, where that interval is saying that the time in that interval, like what time is it? Is it all of the times or none of the times? Is that, do all of those exist for the entire timeline? Or do you just have sort of one inconsistent state that changes to another one, that changes to another one, and the sort of inconsistency rolls across the timeline? Suppose they all exist together, then I just don't think that this is a picture where you have anything like a moving present. You have this like massive inconsistency. The entire timeline is in this giant inconsistent state, but nothing is changing. I think Dan put it in terms of like changing truth values or something like that. You're just not going to have that. The truth values are fixed. They're inconsistent, they're paraconsistent, they're all of the truth values, but they're not changing from one truth value to another. So suppose that it does roll in this sort of rolling way that gets you something that looks a little bit more like passage, well then I think the inconsistency is just not doing any work. The inconsistency doesn't give you the rolling passage, it doesn't do any explanatory work there, it just happens to be that you've got a sort of moving spotlight that's dialethic, but I mean you can have a moving spotlight that's not dialethic. It's not obvious that you're actually getting anything out of the paraconsistency at that point. So I just don't think he's getting you the kind of passage that lots of people are going to want. I don't think he cares. So at some point he says that he wants to develop an account of passage that's neutral between the A theory and the B theory, and you might think, what is that? But actually that's sort of along the lines of a bunch of stuff that people have done in this direction, like Tim Maudlin, Lisa Lange, Natalia Deng. Yes?
I'm sorry, a very naive question. I don't understand the word inconsistent. Does that mean logically contradictory?
Yes.
Or something like that?
Yes. Logically contradictory. So P and not P. Yeah. So the identity function is saying of a time that it is that time and that it's not that time. So it's saying inconsistent things, logically inconsistent things. Yeah. And that's what dialetheism in general means. It's about logical contradictions, not just like metaphysical contradictions or physical contradictions or something like that. It's the strongest notion of contradiction that people think is present. Okay, so I don't think that works, at least if you want a robust account of passage. So I think that there's this other thing that we can do, which is try to explain why the present moves. So this is the paper that Scow has. He says, look, the present moves, but you could imagine that it stops. I think someone referred to this as the freezing present objection. I think Fine maybe raised this objection at one point. And he says, we need some kind of picture of passage that explains why the present moves, if in fact it moves, so that we can sort of rule out the frozen case. Or similarly, you might think, well, if the present can move, why can't it speed up and slow down? We sort of want to rule that out as well, you might think. And he also thinks that the correct answer to the question, what rate does the present move at, is 1 time per time, 1 second per second, and he thinks that that's the result you should get out. Okay? So he builds a model to do that. I'm not going to go through the details because it's quite complicated. I'm just going to give you a sort of overview. First, I'm going to give you a note on the methodology. He makes use of hypertime extensively to do this. So he thinks that models, like if you want to model a moving present, one way to do that is to have 2 temporal dimensions and model the movement of something through 1 dimension in terms of the other. But he doesn't think that hypertime exists. So he takes this to be a kind of idealization, I take it, a kind of useful fiction for understanding passage, understanding in particular how tense operators work. And at the end of the day, he doesn't think that you actually commit to hypertime in virtue of having this kind of explanation. Interesting questions as to whether this methodology is okay. In some sense, it has to be, because we use fictions all over the place in explanation, even in ways where we can't get rid of the fiction. All through science, this is happening. But you might think that there are times when some fictions are okay to use and some not, and maybe this is not an okay use, maybe it is. But I'm just going to follow him in this methodology. I'm just going to grant that that's fine. So the basic idea behind his picture, as I said, it's quite complicated, is that the universe sort of starts off in this massive state of indeterminacy. So there is no fact of the matter as to how things are. He also thinks that the universe is constantly changing, where what it means to constantly change is that the physical state, where you can think of that as like the 3-dimensional configuration of all the particles and interparticle distances, he thinks that that is constantly changing. But the only way that the universe comes to be determinate is if the now moves to a particular time and sort of makes the state at that time determinate. And so he thinks the only way for the universe to keep changing is for the now to keep moving, to sort of reduce the cloud of indeterminacy into continually distinct states. So this is a sort of picture. The box is the present. We've got 2 dimensions of time. These are the physical states. The physical state continually changes, and it's in virtue of continually changing that the present gets dragged through this higher temporal dimension. I'm just going to grant that his explanation works and that it delivers these things. That the present is always moving. The present is moving at 1 time per hypertime, which he thinks is the right answer. That's his sharpened up version of 1 second per second. And that the present always moves into the future and away from the past. I actually think it does work, as far as I can tell. What I want to do, though, is point out some notable features of this explanation. The first one is that it requires that the physical state of the universe is always changing. So this is going to rule out any physical model of the universe in which there is no change. It's also going to rule out any physical model of the universe in which there's a region of the universe in which nothing changes. Because the whole universe, everywhere, has to be constantly changing. So if there's a temporal period in which nothing changes, that's going to be incompatible with his view. It also requires widespread indeterminacy. And he means indeterminacy. He means metaphysical, no fact of the matter stuff, so gaps, metaphysical gaps. And he also requires that time is infinite. That's less obvious. I'm just going to have to take my word for it in this case. I think 1 is a problem, that first implication. So here's what he says. He says, don't we have physical theories that entail that it is at least possible that the universe is not always changing? My metaphysical theory is incompatible with those physical theories, but I don't think that a proponent of my version of the moving spotlight theory should be troubled by this. If a physical theory has a model that correctly represents the actual world and also has models in which the universe is sometimes changeless, he can just revise the theory by throwing out those by his light's impossible world. So the idea here is that when metaphysics and physics clash, the crown goes to metaphysics. And I think that that's a worrying thing to think. Granted, it's about the possibilities. So he thinks that actually, it's not about whether you're ruling out some actual physical theory, like some model of the world that's the actual model. It's merely possible models, but I still think that that is something that we want to be very careful about doing. If physical theory says something's physically possible, I'm inclined to take that pretty seriously. It is a little bit tricky when we're talking about the A theory, though, because you might think that however you develop the A theory, it's going to clash with some of our physical theories. But maybe there's some kind of harm minimization principle that we should have here. Like, if you're going to build a theory of passage, try to reduce the extent to which it clashes with your physical theories. And I think ruling out any model that just has a region of time in which there's no change, even if it's just like a second, I think is a problem. So I think his defense here is a bit unsatisfying. His defense is just metaphysics rules, I think that's more or less what he said. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use dialetheism to do the same explanatory work without that assumption that the physical state is always changing, and that's the sense in which this is going to be better. So here's the basic idea, and I'm going to give you the metaphorical version, and then I'll show you some precise ways of doing this. So the sort of idea, in Scout's view, the core idea is that change is like the engine of the present. The universe is always changing, and in the sense that the physical configuration of the spatial configuration is always changing, and that's what drags the present forward. On this view, inconsistency is the engine of the present. The present moves because it's inconsistent, and nature abhors contradictions. The idea is that, if you can think of this as the whack-a-mole theory of time. So contradiction arises, and nature stamps out the contradiction, but in virtue of stamping out the contradiction pops up somewhere else. And then nature stamps that one out, and it pops up again. And every time it keeps stamping it out, it keeps popping up. And that stamping and popping is the movement of the present. So Christoph was talking yesterday about contradictions that can be reconciled and contradictions that can't, and dialectic transition from contradictions, like from category through contradiction. This looks like a model of that. Okay, I'm going to have to do a lot of stuff here to make this work. So you can sort of get the intuitive idea, but making this look anything sensible is a lot of work. Here's the sort of thing that does the work. You assume that the present is where the past and future meet. And this priest talks about. He also attributes it to Hegel. I couldn't find it in Hegel, but maybe it's there. The point at which the past and future meet is both past and future, we're going to say. So there's our contradiction. We assume that if something's past, it can't be future. If something's future, it can't be past. So if something is both past and future, you've got a contradiction, right? So you just add that. You add that conditional relationship between past and futurity to get the contradiction out. What happens is so the past and future always meet somewhere. The universe removes that contradiction. And when it removes that contradiction, it sort of settles that time as not being contradictory anymore, but then the past and future have to meet somewhere, and so they just sort of recouple at the next moment, stamps that out, it recouples at the next moment, stamps that out, and you just get the dynamics flowing from that. And this continual process is the movement of the present. The present just is the thing that's both past and future. Okay, so there's a picture. So 1 is just past, 0 is just future, and a half is both past and future. And each time you remove the contradiction by making it just past, and I'll say a little bit about why I'm doing that in a minute, it reforms at the next moment. Now that's discrete, and I think it's easiest to see how this works in the discrete case. It's kind of horrifying once you try and extend it to a continuous model of time. All right, here's the precise thing. Here's a sequence of principles that will, I think, give you a model where the present moves, where something moves. I'm calling it the present. Where the present moves, and it moves in this sort of hypertemporal way, and it moves by virtue of contradictions getting settled. I'm going to go through these principles and tell you a little bit about them. I'm not going to go through the details of how you get everything out of these things that I say you can get, but you can in fact prove the things I'm going to say in a minute. Okay, so the first thing, at every hypertime, some time is present. That's the first principle. It's compatible that it's the same time, just from what that principle says. So that doesn't give you motion at all. It could just be like, the present is frozen at the same moment of hypertime for all hypertime. Every time at every hypertime is either past, present, or future. So this rules out a certain kind of temporal indeterminacy. So you can't have things that aren't one of those options, maybe more than one of those options. Okay, so the P2A and P2B, what these capture is the idea that contradictions are getting settled, and also that they're getting settled in a way that preserves the past in particular. So the first principle, if a time at a hypertime is past and future, then it's just past at every later hypertime. So that's the idea that when you've got the contradiction at a hypertime at a time, every hypertime later, the contradiction is gone. So contradictions never come back once they're settled. The universe is very good at getting rid of the contradiction. Then the P2B says if t at ht is just past, then it's just past at all hypertimes that are later than it. So the first principle says that, actually I think I've messed up that second principle. Doesn't matter. We could just stick with P2A for now. It's not going to make any difference. What matters is that if something is past, like just past, that can't be undone. And if a contradiction arises, then the way it gets settled is to make something past rather than future. Okay? And that's going to get you the direction. Then the fourth thing, and this is a sort of betweenness thing that you need in the discrete case, it turns out doesn't play much role later than that. The idea is that it's supposed to capture this idea, P3 and P4 capture the idea that past and future meet, and they meet in both time and hypertime. So in time, there's always a moment at which the past and future meet, but in hypertime, there's always a moment at which the past and future meet as well. I'll give you a picture of this in a minute that will give you a sense of what's going on. Okay. From those principles, I can prove this thing. For any hypertime, if a time is present at that hypertime, then for the next time at the next hypertime, that time is present, and for the previous time at the previous hypertime, that time is present. So from the first four principles, I can prove that the discrete case will look like this. At each moment in time, in hypertime, you've got the contradiction. The contradiction gets settled into just being past, and it stays settled. The present moves forward, and then that gets settled and moves forward, and you get this movement. And this gets you everything I think you want in a discrete case. It gets you the movement of the present. It gets you that the present is moving at one time per hypertime. So at each hypertime, you're going forward one step, and it gets you the direction going into the future. I do have the proof if you're interested, but I'm not going to go through it. Okay, the continuous case, as I said, is much harder. It does work, but you have to put in some extra constraints. So the first thing I can do is I can prove these two things. I can prove that at every hypertime, at least one time is passed that was never passed before. And I can prove at every hypertime, at most one time is passed that was never passed before. So at every hypertime, exactly one time is passed that was never passed before. And with P5, which I didn't mention, which I'll come back to now, the idea that the present moves at the same rate that the past grows, it follows from those two things that the present is moving at one time per hypertime, because the past is growing at one time per hypertime, the present moves at the rate that the past grows, and so the present is moving at one time per hypertime. So this is for the continuous case. This doesn't quite work. What it gets you is if you sort of take a function that goes from each hypertime to the time that it's present, the two previous principles will get you a sort of a continuous function that has a constant slope like this, so it won't have any zero derivatives anywhere, so it won't slow, it won't speed up, it'll just stay at a constant rate the whole time. But from everything I've said, it's compatible that there are times that are past or future that never get to be present. Because, you might just have to take my word for this, you could have it, all that the previous principles show you is that at every hypertime, some time is, like the times that are present are continually increasing, but you could take all of time and just, because it's continuous, just map within an interval of hypertime every time. And it could be that all of time is broader than what you end up mapping to hypertime. So you have this situation where you've got these times that are later than anything that ever happens that never get to be present. And I think that that's a problem. You can fix it, but you have to add in a couple of things. You have to make everything finite. And then you have to assume that the first moment of time is present at the first moment of hypertime. the last moment, whatever time is present at the last moment of hypertime is the last moment of time, and that the first and last moments of hypertime are distinct. Once you do that, you get that the first moment of time is present at the first moment of hypertime, the last moment of time is present at the last moment of hypertime, and then from there I can prove that the interval between them, every time in that interval is present at some hypertime in that interval, which is to say, I get this picture if I add in those constraints. So I can get this very nice linear function of times that are present at hypertimes. And this looks like, in the continuous case, it does everything you want. It gets you the direction, it gets you a constant slope of 1 time per hypertime, and it gets you a continuous movement of the present. It is finite. Okay. All right, 5 minutes to compare the explanations. And I think we're pretty good. So that's the dialethic explanation. Just to reiterate it a little bit, you've got this whack-a-mole picture where you've got these contradictions that keep popping up. You slap them down and they keep turning up. Works very nicely in the discrete case. There is a generalization in the continuous case. It requires a bit of work, but hopefully you can see that if it works in the discrete case, that process, as long as you can sort of dial up everything in the right way, it should work in the continuous case as well. Now, if we compare the explanations, we have the following table. I think that the explanation, as I said, is no worse than the explanation that Scow gave, and better in a couple of ways. So his goes for gaps, mine goes for gluts. You might hate contradictions, but I think if you hate contradictions, you should probably also hate indeterminacy, because the kinds of things that you need to deal with indeterminacy, to do with two truth value gaps, there being no fact of the matter, are very similar to the kinds of things you need to do to deal with contradictions. In fact, a bunch of the logics that you use for truth value gaps just are logics that work for truth value gluts as well. So you're sort of dealing in the same non-classical space in a lot of ways whether you've got gaps or gluts. So I don't think that merely having the contradictions makes this worse, but I'm sure there are people who disagree with that. His requires the past and future infinite, mine requires the past and future finite. I don't know, they both seem equally bad. His requires that the physical state must change, and mine does not. There's nothing I said in this was there anything about physical states of the world changing and the actual configuration things. Everything could be completely unchanging in the sense that, you just have a single particle sitting in the same place for all of time, and still the present would move. So it doesn't require change. And I think that that's a good making feature of the account. Yeah, so basically both of them are restricted to only certain models, but I think the dialethic one is actually compatible with a larger range of models of how the universe might be. So that's a nice feature of it. All right, I've got a bunch of objections that I will talk about, but I think the main one I'm going to talk about is this one. People hate contradictions. We just shouldn't accept them. And I think it's worth me clarifying the structure of the argument here. The structure of the argument is not, contradictions are good, we can use them for passage, yay. Right? The argument is, we can use contradictions for passage, so we should believe in them. Right? So I don't need to motivate to you that you should believe in contradictions independently of the inference of the best explanation that I'm running here. So the very argument I've given you is giving you that reason to believe in contradictions. So if you hate them, well, this argument is putting pressure on you to hate them less. Okay, the other one I'll talk about is this. So some people think we have reason to believe in gaps that are independent of anything I've said here. So Oliver was talking about open future stuff yesterday. There is a group of open future people who think that the future is open in the sense that bivalence fails, which is failure of law of excluded middle, which brings with you truth value gaps, right? You get metaphysical indeterminacy about the future. Vagueness, lots of people think that way of dealing with vagueness, cases like the Sorites paradox, way to deal with that is to invoke truth value gaps. And you might think, well, look, there's no reason to believe in gluts, there's no reason to believe in contradictions, that's like that. But actually, that's not quite right. So on the one hand, it's controversial that the open future requires gaps. You could, I imagine, and I don't know that I've ever seen it, give a dialethic account of the open future. And so you would have to at least compare those explanations before you run this kind of objection. The other reasons to believe in gaps are extremely controversial, and there the case has been made that dialetheism is the best view. And so you're going to have to go up against the dialetheists. So in case of vagueness, in case of the liar, all of the other reasons that people use to motivate the existence of indeterminacy, dialetheism has been offered as the better explanation. So you've got some work to do, I think, to run that kind of objection against this picture. All right, summarize. We've got this indirect argument, time really passes, which is the argument from experience. The best explanation of this appeals to dialetheism, and so the passage of time is both real and inconsistent. I've made a case for that second premise by formulating a dialethic explanation of passage and comparing it to the scale picture. There is lots to not like here, I recognize that. I've used hypertime, I've used contradictions, I've used the things that people love to hate in philosophy. Even if you think that this is a complete failure, what an interesting failure. What an interesting thing that you can, it turns out you can do and make quite a detailed, consistent model of. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, I am quite puzzled by your talk because I don't know exactly what you call time when you speak about time, and for me it is more or less the Newtonian time, and so if you take time as being Newtonian time, many properties that you mentioned are in fact not properties, they are the definition of time. But as I mentioned yesterday, if you take the relativistic view, well, formally I would say there is no time, but of course you can define something which you call time, which is constrained by having some properties, but you have a very large arbitrary to define that function. But in some cases, for some space-time which are solutions of general relativity, it is impossible to define a function that you call time. I mean, even if you try to define something that you call time, it will never obey the properties that you mentioned. For instance, there are many models where there is no event which is both present and future. I mean, past and future have no intersection at all. And there are also some models where every point in the universe is both in your future and in your past. I mean, for instance, in the universe, even the past event is in my future. So, and there are also some models where the past, for instance, is not growing because the past is the whole universe. So even if I evolve in the universe, my past is not growing. So I think that many properties you mentioned cannot be obeyed by a function that you call time in some models of the relativistic universe. And so for me, you have some kind of close reasoning, because everything that you show that time obeys is in fact already in the definition of what you call time. So
yeah, I mean, everything you've just said applies to Scal's view as well. So I'll say that straight away. So his view is going to be problematic with relativistic physics just as much as the view that I put forward. So the main argument that this is no worse than Scal's view is not going to be affected by that. But just sort of dialectically, a lot of this conversation about the A theory is downstream of a big discussion about whether the A theory is compatible with relativistic physics. And there's just, I think, an open question about this. So you're right that there are lots of models of general relativity that are quite unfriendly to the A theory, so models that aren't globally hyperbolic, models that don't like have closed time-like curves and certain global properties that rule out like very nice Newtonian type planes of time. And A theorists have a problem with that. And so there are a couple of different things that they try and do. One of them is to pick a version of general relativity that has a fixed foliation in it and ignore the cases that have closed time-like curves, which gets rid of a lot of those pathological properties that you're pointing to. Another thing they do is say, well, so much the worse for general relativity. Let's go for a different theory and find a theory that is compatible with the A theory. And another thing they do is say, well, look, general relativity is going to be superseded by quantum gravity, and we don't know what time is going to be like in quantum gravity. For all we know, it's going to obey the kinds of nice features that the A theory has. I don't think anything that I've said is any worse on this picture than A theories in general, but I fully take the point that A theories have a problem with relativity that needs to be worked out.
Yeah, so I think we understand how the process of removal of contradictions works.
Mm-hmm.
So take the case of discrete time, so you have this time t, it's both past and future.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a contradiction that is in line.
Yeah.
Now the question, what you want is that the removal brings you to the next time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what forces things to be that way? So rather than moving to the previous time or moving to 10 times ahead.
It's
so what forces the movement? Yeah.
What forces it is the principles I've packed into the model, right? And you might wonder whether that's a reasonable thing to do. There's lots of principles packed into Scale's model as well. The main one is the P2A principle. So what this is saying is that when you settle a contradiction, you settle it past-wise rather than future-wise, right? So you've got a contradiction, you want to make it just past or just future. There's a choice, which one do you pick? Just past. Now, why have I gone that way? My thinking is that it's got something to do with the fixity of the past. The idea that if something is past, then that can't be undone. And so when something is present, in this case, it is both past and future. So it's already past. So you can't undo the pastness of it, but you can undo the futureness of it because the past is fixed and the future is not. That's the idea. The principles that I put in do in fact get you this picture. So that it does have this like feature where the present keeps moving through hypertime like that, but the justification is something like that. Scale's picture uses a very similar thing. He requires the fixedness of the past in a similar kind of way. He requires that the indeterminacy, the sort of cloud of indeterminacy that shrinks as the present moves, does not repopulate in the past. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this brings out what makes life so difficult. I mean, you've done something really, you've given yourself a very difficult task. What makes the task so particularly difficult is the commitment, I think, that this isn't using Dialethism as an explanation, right? Because then you have to go for get out all the principles concerning, like that which Bruce was mentioned, concerning how time works.
Mm.
Not the time in the past. So is that commitment that's made it so hard for you? You have to reverse engineer all the principles concerning time.
Yes, that's right. And then, I mean,
it's not obvious. So then it's not obvious.
I don't have to explain all of them though. I just have to get a bunch of principles that do the work. These principles do in fact do the work. And then the question is, should we believe those principles?
To say an answer to that question, the fixity of the past is the motivating reason for that principle.
Yeah.
His intention was your previous claim that this isn't an explanation of time using contradiction, because then you're giving some principle of time.
So I mean, this is. Oh, hang on. I'm not sure I'm quite right. So this is an explanation of the passage of time that uses contradiction, right? But the claim is that this should boost, like if you're an atheist, it should boost your credence in contradictions. And so what I was trying to deflect is the worry that we shouldn't believe in contradictions, so this is not going to work. And in some sense, some version of that's going to work, but I think you have to be careful about how inference the best explanation works, so that if someone gives you an explanation of something that contradicts something you believe, you don't just flatly reject the explanation, you have to look at the reason for the explanation. So that's what I take it as going on here. This is like, I'm using the contradictions to do explanatory work, and that's lifting our credence in the contradictions and in the dialectic picture of passage. But there was something else you said that was interesting. So maybe this is behind what's going on. So the sort of meta reasoning that I do about justifying the principles, you might think I'm like perfectly classical there. So how do I get to be perfectly classical there whilst using contradictions in the first order? This is an issue with dialethism. So you look at the semantics for dialethism, it's classical. Like the meta-semantics for dialethism is classical. And so people have said, well, what's going on here? You want to be a dialethist, but you're using classical reasoning in the back end. You can rebuild all of the meta-semantics for dialethism using non-classical systems. It's not easy though, and this is a real problem. But I guess I don't even know that you have to. I think dialethism is not the view that once you've gone in for contradictions, you can never reason classically.
No, yeah.
So I think it's okay to sort of reason classically at the meta level, despite the first order level being dialectic.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
Next on the list is Emily.
Thank you for that. So maybe I have read too much Hegel.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So we have this contradiction, it gets resolved, and then we have a new present moment appear. Why does the new present moment appear?
Because sorry.
Well, just use the Hegel. I get meaning nothingness, you becoming like the resolution. It's not obvious to me that the present is the resolution of the past and the future. And maybe that's not what you're going for. But yeah, why does the new present?
It's because of this idea that the past and future have to keep meeting, which is something that Mark was putting pressure on in the relativistic case. It's not obvious that this is true in the relativistic case. It looks like in a-theoretic views, it might be true that the past and future are always meeting somewhere. And the idea is that when they meet, you have to say something about like the boundary between them where they meet. And the view here is that where they meet is both past and future, and that's a problem when you get rid of it. But the past and future have to keep rejoining. So think of it like a ribbon that you cut, and then it keeps rejoining, you have to keep cutting it. And because it's got this because the past and future constantly have to keep meeting, the contradiction keeps reforming. So I don't think it is like the Hegelian thing. It's definitely not like a resolved contradiction. It might be a contradiction that is not in the taxonomy that we had, where it was like the resolved ones versus the not resolved ones. This is like something that gets resolved, but then it always produces a new one. Yeah.
Is this actually explaining the fixity of the past rather than the passage of time? Because it's the continual past and future meeting thing that's providing passage.
Yes.
So where the contradictions are then resolved, that's just explaining why there's a past.
Yeah, so it is. So you could have, let me sort of put this question in a slightly different way that might be, I think, useful. Where's the picture? So you look at this picture. I've used 3 values, right? Any 3-valued thing you could plug in here. I've said that third value is both past and future, which is because past and future meet, how they meet with both past and future. But you could do it with like any sort of 3-value thing. And then the question is, well, why do it my way rather than some 3-value way? I think I'm sort of edging towards your question here. And the answer is because if you do it some other way, it's not obvious why the thing moves, basically. And I think the contradictions do give you a sense of why the thing moves, because when the past and future, when you sort of get rid of that contradiction, well, and you say, well, when the contradiction goes, it can't be rebuilt there, then the past and future can't meet there because that would be a contradiction, so it's going to have to reform somewhere else. That's the idea. I mean, you don't have to like it. That's fair enough, but yeah.
Collection of questions about the first principle.
Oh yeah.
So that's coming from this idea that the past and future meet.
That first principle is not coming from there. It's just something I've stuck in by hand,
right,
which might make what you're going to say even more pointed.
So I was associating the first principle with this thing you were just saying from Hegel that the past and future meet, but you're also getting to the boundary
was just, wondering whether you can say more about why you should think that the boundary is both past and future. So why isn't the present something which is neither past nor future, but is the boundary of both, and therefore it's still true that they both meet?
Yep.
And it seems to me that the continuum case might be more friendly to you if you say the past. There's a last past moment. There's a first future moment. Then you're going to get that the boundary has to be.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, they don't meet. And then I was wondering, well, what about, have you thought about this in a junkie situation? There you might, I was worried you might, have a meeting without needing a present at all, or whether you're actually then going to get pushed to a position like that will combine this view with also the priest's original view, where you have a little there's always a finite, temporally finite bit of time where you've got the
some interesting questions there. I guess one thing I'm going to do, which is a little bit annoying, is emphasize that these principles are, we come to believe the principles because of the explanatory work that they do. When I'm not saying, here's a bunch of principles that are independently plausible, now let's use them to explain passage. So these principles, what matters is if these principles do the explanatory work, and is the model that I've built any more or less questionable than the principles that Scow uses. I can go through Scow's principles, but he's got a laundry list of principles as well, and we can think about which ones of those we should believe. So that's the sort of annoying thing. The more direct thing about the meeting of past and future, there is this argument in Priest, and I'm sort of hesitant to run it, but I'll give it to you and you can see what you think. So he talks about there being a moment of change. So you think about something going from green to blue, and he says at some moment the thing stops being green and it starts being blue. At that moment, what is the thing like? And he says, well, to say that it's green would be arbitrary. To say that it's blue would be arbitrary. To say that it's neither is ruled out by other things he says. The best answer is that it's both. And then, and this is sort of in line with his Hegelian picture of change that he does. This is a sort of different tangent of the stuff he does. He sort of drops this later on. That could get you this, right? So past and future meet. They've got to meet somewhen. What is it like when they meet? Well, it would be arbitrary to say it's past, it's arbitrary to say it's future. The indeterminacy principle rules out that it's none of them, so it's got to be both.
Here, we've got the indeterminacy just being present, and present is the third, it's the boundary, it's neither past nor future. So I can see in case of change, it looks like it's red, it's blue, it's got to be something in the middle. So it seems to me that in the case of change, there's more of a pressure to say that the boundary has to be at least one.
No, I completely agree. And so I don't see the argument. I haven't found a way to make the argument, that analogous argument here, because of this idea that the present could be this just third category that is neither past nor future. That's why I want to just rest back on the annoying thing, which is to say, I'm not motivating these as independent principles. I'm motivating them on the grounds of the work that they can do.
Yes, thanks for the interesting talk. And I just wanted to get clear on the general dialectical situation, because you started your talk with this unhappy situation where the B theorists reject the A theorist premise, the A theorists reject the B theorist premise, and in his view you rely on the distinction between past and future being ontologically significant and distinct, which is of course precisely what the B theorists reject. So are we again in the same unhappy dialectical situation we started?
No, I don't think we are. So if we come back to the indirect argument, this is not supposed to be an argument that's going to convince a B theorist. So the unhappy dialectic situation was that this was going to convince, the direct argument convinces no one. The B theorist just goes, well, time doesn't really pass. The A theorist goes, time passes, but it's consistent, and no one gets to passage dialethism. This version, the B theorist is still going to say, time doesn't really pass. And so they're going to have no reason to buy this argument, but the A theorist can't say that. And so this argument is supposed to pull the A theorist into passage dialethism. So it's not the same unhappy situation, because the unhappy situation was no one is going to care, whereas this situation is half the people are going to care. The other half is still not going to care.
some text from Hegel about this concept of change, because Hegel addresses this notion in the science of logic and in the philosophy of nature. So I'm really aware that we have paper, but it would be interesting to know where in Hegel he takes this concept of change. Question. Second question about the notion of hypertime. In the big spotlight theory from School needs an hypertime because everything that moves in time. So if you have a moving now, you need an hypertime, like and it's a metaphor or idealization. And my question is, if hypertime is a time, do we need moving now in the second hypertime? And in this case, you have the risk of anything request. So your hypertime is without moving now. It's we have with this notion of hypertime, and so all this picture with contradictions and very Hegelian, but not this idea of hypertime. And the third question is about future. You said in the discussion that for you use the idea that future is fixed and past is fixed and future is certain. But in the movie spotlight theory, which is sort of counter-model or incremental model for you, I think that the future, there is just one future, the future is fixed. So my question is in your model with Dialethism, you have an open future, or just one future at each moment of time?
Okay, let me see if I can go through it. So first one, where does Priest talk about Hegel? Like, where does Priest point to Hegel? It's in the Science of Logic, I think. I had a look at the places that Priest points to. Your guess is as good as mine. I'm not convinced that the spread principle, for instance, is in Hegel. I couldn't find anything that was like that. I think it's very impressionistic. I think Priest read Hegel and thought, maybe this. But he points to the Science of Logic. The second question about something. What was the second question?
It's about hypertime.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm going to say something really obnoxious here. Yeah. Yeah. So I think the answer is no, and I've got arguments for why, but I'm not going to go through them right now. But I think that there's no reason to think that just because one temporal dimension behaves in a certain way, that all of them have to behave that way. So the sort of inference that people draw, which was drawn by a bunch of people when talking about the rate of passage stuff. They said, well, look, if time passes if the now moves in time, surely the now has to move in hypertime. So then you're going to have hypertime and so on ad infinitum. I just think that reasoning is no good because there's no good reason to think that the way that time works extends to every temporal dimension. Then the third thing was about the open future. The future can be open here in the sense that the stuff that happens can be open. So the only thing that's fixed in some sense here is that there will be a future, but it's not fixed what happens in that future. So this is compatible with open future type pictures. I shudder to think of the complexity of like taking this and combining it with what Oliver was talking about, which already seems pretty like a branching version of this or something. But as far as I can tell, yeah, you can make an open future with this. Yeah.